This is one of 3 videos that I'm making for week 7 of HumCore 2301, and in this video I'm going to talk about manga, or Japanese comics. A good basic definition of comics comes from Scott McCloud. He defines the form as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer, end quote. Manga conform to this basic formal definition, but they have specific social significance in the context of Japan. They are a ubiquitous feature of leisure time culture in modern Japan. Peter Deuce alludes to this fact when he says, manga, like television, have become a powerful medium for entertainment, the transmission of knowledge, and the diffusion of values. And here are some figures to give you a sense of the ubiquity of manga in Japanese culture. Annually, Japan produces 2.3 billion manga books and magazines and sells nearly 1.9 billion. That's over 15 manga for every man, woman, and child in Japan. Manga comprise 40% of total books and magazine sales in Japan. According to one survey, 69% of high school students read manga regularly. According to another survey, adult male white-collar workers reportedly spend 15% of their free time reading manga. Adult male blue-collar workers spend 28% of their free time reading manga. Now, the history of what we think of as manga probably starts in the years after World War II, but there are precedents that can be traced back earlier. The earliest use of the term manga appeared in 1819, and it was part of a title of a collection of illustrations called Hokusai manga. In the beginning of the Meiji period, humor magazines were popular, and they contained various illustrations and caricatures that can be seen as early antecedents of what became comics. Starting in the beginning of the 20th century, newspapers started to include serialized comics as a way to attract readers. And the first daily serialized comic to appear in the newspaper was a series called Easygoing Daddy, about a silly and funny older man in Taisho period Japan. During the war, like every other form of cultural production, comics were mobilized for the war effort, and you see a lot of propaganda material being produced. After the war, we see the first examples of what are considered to be modern manga. The first producer of this kind of material is none other than Tezuka Osamu, the king of manga. And his first important work is Shin Takurajima, or New Treasure Island, which establishes much of the visual lexicon for modern Japanese comics. Another important development in comics is the emergence of what are known as gekiga, or dramatic stories. These are comics that start to be produced in the mid-1950s. They also establish a lot of the visual language of comics, but they address more adult topics. They contain violence and grittier subject matter, and they really appeal less to children and more to adults. Most manga initially appear in manga magazines. These are publications that come out on a weekly basis, a bi-weekly basis, or a monthly basis. They're quite large, often 400 pages. They are fairly cheap, about 400 yen, so about $4. The cover tends to be color, but the interior tends to be black and white, and the quality of the paper is quite low. That's why they're so cheap. It is estimated that each manga magazine is read by at least 3 different people. So someone buys it and takes it home, and other members of their family read it, or they take it to work and other people at work read it, or they leave it on the train because it's so cheap and someone else picks it up and reads it, or they pull it out of the recycling bin. And they're also read quite quickly. It is estimated that it takes a typical person about 20 minutes to read one of these magazines, which breaks down to about 4 seconds per page. So they're consumed very rapidly. There are 4 main categories of manga: seinen manga, or adult male comics; ladies comics, or adult female comics; shonen manga, or boys comics; and shoujo manga, or girls comics. And I think it's important to keep in mind that these categories refer less to the demographic of readers than they describe the visual style and content of these different categories. Adult male manga tend to have the most realistic illustration style, and the content tends to be the least fantastic. Shima Kosaku, for example, is a very popular series that portrays the struggles and triumphs of a Japanese executive. Ladies' comics are somewhat of a surprise to non-Japanese readers because they contain extensive erotic content. And this is a surprise to non-Japanese readers, especially American readers, because in America there's a tendency to associate erotica or pornography with male consumers. But in Japan, it's ladies' comics that contain most of the erotic content. Boys' comics are probably the most internationally familiar category of manga. They are the ones that, so most of the action and sci-fi supernatural franchises that we're familiar with belong to this category. And also the visual language that's used in male comics has come to define manga in general for international audiences. Girls' comics also have a very distinctive visual style, most notably the giant eyes. Another interesting feature of girls' comics is that among the different genres of manga, it is girls' comics that seem to respond most to the input of their consumers. And so, for example, you see on the bottom of this page a little snippet that is supposedly been contributed by a reader. And so artists who produce shoujo manga are famous for changing storylines in response to the input of readers and responding in various ways to the requests of their audience. Considered to be one of the most popular and influential examples of shoujo manga was Rose of Versailles, and it established important precedents both in the content and style of shoujo manga. It was composed by Ikeda Ryoko, who was numbered among a group of young female innovative manga artists who emerged in the early 1970s, just at the moment when readership for shoujo manga was expanding from elementary school girls to older demographics of female consumers. It also, her career marks the beginning of an important new phase in shoujo manga, in that up until that point in the 50s and 60s, shoujo manga had been exclusively produced by male artists, and it wasn't until the early 1970s that you started to have important female artists producing shoujo manga. Like most manga, Rose of Versailles was initially serialized in a manga magazine, and it was serialized in the magazine Margaret from April 1972 to December of 1973. And the story is set in the French royal court of Louis XVI, and it recounts the romantic travails of various court women set against the drama of the French Revolution. Initially, the main focus of the comic was the character of Marie Antoinette, who you see on the left. But as the story was serialized, Marie Antoinette is eclipsed by the character Oscar Francois de Jarget, the daughter of a military officer who is raised as a boy and serves as a palace guard. Ikeda shifted the spotlight from Marie Antoinette to Oscar in response to requests from readers who were fascinated by the dashing character who appears on the right. And this is also seen as one of the earliest examples of an artist responding to the input of her audience. So this is another way that Ikeda was innovative and influenced later manga artists. The Rose of Versailles was eventually released as a 10-volume series, and it became one of the best-selling manga in the history of manga publication in Japan. In 1974, it was adapted for a stage musical by the all-woman Takarazuka Review, and has since remained one of the most popular and frequently revived productions. In 1979, the story was adapted as an animated TV series, which was also extremely popular. And Rose of Versailles is seen as a foundational and innovative manga for a number of reasons. In terms of its content, it introduced more serious themes in an effort to appeal to more mature consumers. It is noted as one of the first shoujo manga to contain a bedroom scene, which was quite an event when it happened. Deborah Shamoun argues that in particular it offers a radically new vision of romantic love premised on equality between the sexes, which is something that hadn't really been portrayed in earlier shoujo manga. And Ikeda was also innovative in terms of the style of composition. She developed this really florid Rococo style that has since become associated with shoujo manga. So Rose of Versailles was extremely influential. It marked an important transition from an early, more childish focus to a more adult focus, and it struck an amazing chord with readers, becoming one of the most popular and influential manga ever published in Japan.